It's another episode of Why Wasn't It Better? I am your host, Patrick Darms.
And I am your first science officer, Anton Paras.
Anton, glad you could be aboard for this one.
A pleasure to be aboard, Captain.
We're doing a little night recording here, late night for me. Never done that before.
It's an evening recording. We're excited to be going on to this frontier.
That's right. The human adventure is just beginning because we're here to talk about Star Trek, the motion picture.
Mm-hmm.
I had to remind a couple people that asked about our list for this. They're like, which Star Trek movie is that? Is that the J.J. Abrams ones? I'm like, no. That's how you can tell the real Trek fans.
It's not even in the title. Like, it's Star Trek,
right.
The motion picture.
It is an unusual title, and I was trying to think, would it improve other movies to call it like Batman, the motion picture, Gladiator, the motion picture?
I was thinking, too, like, when you add a title like that to a film, it makes it very dated. And I was thinking, well, maybe it was at a time when motion pictures were a significant thing and it was different from like the still pictures. And it's like, no, this was 1979. There's a lot of movies at this point.
Airport, the motion picture. Should have been called that. I was really looking forward to covering this one.
Yeah.
This is one that I chose.
I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so I was really excited to see this on the list. And I think it's an excellent decision. And we're going to have a lot of fun talking about this film.
Absolutely. I'm a huge Trek fan as well, as you know. I came to Trek, I would say, later in life, which I'll get into when I explain why I chose this movie. We mentioned this on the last recording we did, which we're kind of recording these out of order and just releasing them to try to get everything out by the end of the season. We have the schedule kind of mapped out. We're looking to wrap up season 2 towards the middle of October. And of course, our season finale is going to be Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Please bear with us, and we appreciate it.
And, you know, our listeners are awesome, so I'm sure they're going to be flexible, and they're just going to be excited to see whatever we put out. And I do have to say thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey. We're really excited to be here in season 2, and we're appreciative for everyone that has subscribed and followed us across our different platforms.
Absolutely.
Engage. The Federation calls on Admiral James T. Kirk and the crew of the Starship Enterprise to intercept an immense mysterious object that's on a crash course with Earth. After investigating, the crew discovers that the alien cloud harbors artificial intelligence with an ominous primary directive. Crisis strikes when a probe dispatched by the energy cloud attacks the crew, abducting navigator Lieutenant Ilya. An android lookalike containing her memories shows up soon after. Released on December 7th, 1979 by Paramount Pictures. Directed by Robert Wise. Screenplay by Harold Livingston with a story credit for Alan Dean Foster. Starring William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, James Doohan, Stephen Collins, Persis Khambatta, George Takei, Walter Koenig, and Nichelle Nichols, with a budget at $44 million, which was $182 million adjusted for inflation, with a box office at $139 million, $575 million adjusted for inflation. Star Trek, the motion picture. Patrick, why was this movie chosen?
Tease it a little bit in the beginning, but I am a massive Star Trek fan. I came to Trek later in life, and I mean like my late 20s. I saw the original series with my dad because he was a big fan, and I enjoyed it for what it was. I saw this particular movie at some point when I was a kid, and of course, I hated it. I was bored to tears by it. This is not a movie for kids. I would never probably attempt to show anyone under 12 this film. They would probably fall asleep. But I always associated this with like quote unquote bad Trek. I had heard the theory about like, well, all the even numbered Trek movies are the bad ones. And I really liked Wrath of Khan, and it was so much different than this. And, you know, this was just the boring one to me. So I always had like a weird relationship with this particular movie. I always liked Star Wars better. It was more exciting. It had more of a fun, expanded universe when you're a kid. And I didn't really get back into Trek or into Trek at all until I was in my late 20s. And I rewatched the original series. Then I watched The Next Generation. Then I watched Deep Space Nine, and I revisited these original films. And I developed a newfound appreciation for this particular film. And of course, it was the first Star Trek film ever. It was one of the first TV series that really got adapted into a big screen movie version solely because the fans demanded it. And that's something I find pretty cool. So I just thought that this movie was a natural selection for Why Wasn't It Better? Because although this movie made money, it's a polarizing film. It was weirdly received by audiences when it came out. It had a particular reputation for years, its nickname being the Motionless Picture, and it has very little in common with the rest of the original series of films, from The Wrath of Khan all the way up to Undiscovered Country. Those films look and feel very different from this one. So this is very much the outlier in the series. And that's why I wanted to cover it.
Yeah, great overview, very well said. And I just wanted to tease there. Would it be fair to say that this film was so influential in the way Star Trek films were made because of how the first one turned out?
Yeah, the first one really affected how the rest of them were like developed. And it was like they were trying to go out of their way to avoid repeating what they had done with this film, which we're going to get into in the reasons a little bit. But it
Yes, we
is,
will.
there's the best way I could describe this film as an outlier. If you've never seen
Hmm.
it before and you've seen some of the other Trek films, I think you'd be pretty surprised if you watched this.
I think the listeners want to know, who's your favorite captain?
Probably Picard. And I say that just because I'm so fond of The Next Generation. Although it's
Yeah,
hard not to like Shatner, right?
it's it's very, they're very
Yeah,
distinctly
they
different
are.
captains.
They are. Who's
But
yours?
I grew up with the Next Generation.
Okay.
Picard's my main man, but Shatner and just Captain Kirk in general is has a very special place in my heart.
Just for the record, Next Generation and Deep Space Nine are two of like my all-time favorite TV series.
Yeah, that's completely agree. It's science fiction for philosophers, right? It's very deep, engrossing stories, and just especially when you grow up with it, it's hard not to just love, especially with so much amazing content in this universe. So I think, if anything, I did want to make sure that we give our due respect to Gene Roddenberry for really
Oh
bringing
yeah.
this to us.
I can only imagine what it would have been like to have seen the original series when it first came on TV. And I remember like my dad telling me everything about it. He's like, it was so radical. There was nothing remotely like it on TV. It just came out of
Right.
nowhere.
It was
And of course, it didn't
very,
even last
yeah,
that long. Barely, 3 seasons and then canceled. And
barely.
it
Yep.
really became the show that it became because of syndication, because of reruns. That's
And it
the
was a
interesting
big,
thing about it.
yeah, it was a big deal that the film was coming out, or was even going to come out, because a lot of people were clamoring for it, anticipating it. So, yeah, very exciting that they were able to revive Star Trek at all.
Yeah, and then of course it's developed into something enormous.
And I like to think, certain things happened for a reason, and I still feel like Star Trek ended up being able to find its way over the years.
One quick point I wanted to hit on, and I wanted your thoughts on this before I forget. Where does this compare to Star Wars with you? I'm not, because they're not two things that need to be compared. But for before you answer that, I just want to preface this: the older I get, the more I like Star Trek, and the less I like Star Wars. And I don't know why that is necessarily.
It's funny because I think this is one of those iconic, like, clashes of the fan bases. What's better, Star Trek or Star Wars? And I know that's not the question here. It's, which do I prefer? And I totally agree with you that as I've gotten older, I've appreciated Star Trek more and more. If Star Wars lightly draws upon different philosophies to influence its universe and its characters, like, for example, the Jedi Order, Star Trek is deeply rooted in, from all sorts of, philosophies, different forms of just very, I'd say, like, deeper insightful, just questions about not just like science fiction topics, but also just about humanity, about deep questions that a lot of people maybe wouldn't ask, but when offered the opportunity to consume it in the form of like Star Trek and like an adventuring crew and being able to approach those deep questions, it's more consumable, more fun, and I feel like the way that they do it is just amazing. So I think that's why I've really grown to appreciate it more and more as I've gotten older. I don't think that Star Wars necessarily dives into those same questions as heavily. I think it's a bit more cookie cutter philosophical, if that's fair.
It's certainly become that. I mean, Star Wars is just fan fiction at this point. It's no longer the thing that it
Yeah.
was, which is, for better or worse, it
Yeah.
was the creation of George Lucas. But we don't have to talk about Star Wars.
Right.
I actually
Right.
don't think that they should be compared, because this Star Trek is actual pure science fiction. Star Wars is just fantasy. I don't mean that in a negative way, but
Like
it's
in
not.
the
If it's not really science fiction. It takes place in a fantastical fictional universe. It just happens to have spaceships and stuff.
right, I see what you're saying. It's more the distinction of what puts it in the category.
Right. Right. I always associated Star Wars with more fantasy than like science fiction. When I think of science fiction, I think of Star Trek, I think of Blade Runner, I think of Aliens, I think of
Right.
Minority Report. I think of stuff that is at least grounded in our reality, in our universe, associated with Earth, right?
Right, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the development, but those are things that had to be consulted when even developing the film, is like how rooted is the logic in the film with actual science fiction and actual grounded theories, right?
Right. And let's get into the development. Let's talk about the production history. I did not include it as a reason, but the making of this film is a checkered one. It's kind of a miracle this film wasn't a disaster. Just for a bit of history, Star Trek, the original series, ran from 1966 to 1969, like we touched on, but it was never a huge hit when it was on TV. It did extremely well in syndication, reruns. So well that by 1975, Paramount was convinced to begin work on a feature film. And also worth noting, during this time, it only lasted 2 seasons, but there was a Star Trek the Animated Series which featured the voices of the original cast, and it's actually not bad if you've ever checked it out.
I have it on VHS actually.
Yeah,
So
it's not bad. It's
yeah.
okay. So the entire cast initially agreed to return for this film. It's worth pointing out that Star Trek was so popular with its fans that they successfully lobbied NASA to rename the first space shuttle the Enterprise. Pretty cool. Now, so Gene Roddenberry, he wrote a screenplay. He completed it in early 1976, but it was disliked by the studio. So a group of screenwriters was hired to work on a parallel script, which was titled Star Trek Planet of the Titans. Legendary production designer Ken Adam was hired to design the sets at one point, but he did not get along with Roddenberry and left the project. Some of his design ideas would later be used for the James Bond film Moonraker. Pretty cool. The development of this Planet of the Titans is worth reading, and if you're at all a Trek fan, I recommend looking into it. It's pretty wild what that movie could have been. And at one point, get this, Anton, Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas were all asked to direct it.
Wild, man. That is wild.
Yeah. Eventually, Philip Kaufman signed on to direct the film, and he worked with Roddenberry on the script. Kaufman is probably best known for directing the movie The Right Stuff about the early space program, and he also directed a film that we have frequently mentioned on this podcast, Rising Sun, with Sean Connery. But anyway, back to Star Trek. In March 1977, Paramount officially canceled the film, citing disagreements over the script. Some of the studio executives who would make the decision were young Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg. And if you know your movie industry power figures, these two are big names.
Yeah, we can go ahead and tie those to the House of Mouse, as well as a very well-known studio, of course, as well, DreamWorks.
The studio proposed to Roddenberry that he instead restart Star Trek as a TV series, and they were going to call it Phase 2. Paramount hoped the new series would form the cornerstone for a new television network that never realized Paramount television service. That's also worth reading about if you want your history of streaming services.
Yeah, that's fun to know. They
Yeah, right?
how far away are we from the USS Enterprise being reality?
Well, I mean, we had the space shuttle Enterprise, but the
That's
actual
fair.
Enterprise, yeah, I don't think we're gonna live to see that.
We'll wait a little bit. Give it about a couple years.
Yeah. By late 1977, the new series pilot was called In Thy Image, and it was based on a 2-page outline by Roddenberry about a NASA probe returning to Earth, having gained sentience. Alan Dean Foster wrote a treatment for the pilot, which Harold Livingston turned into a teleplay. When the script was presented to Michael Eisner, he declared it worthy of a feature film. Not really sure why. Um, but here is the why. So, you're probably wondering, how could they have made this film post Star Wars, right? Because this is, without spoiling our opinion of the film too much, it's like one of the criticisms of of this movie is just how slow it is. But the reason for it is because of the success of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That movie convinced Paramount that a slow-moving, non-action-based science fiction film could succeed at the box office. So that November, mere weeks before the production on Phase 2 was due to start, the studio announced that the TV series had been canceled in favor of a feature film.
One thing I wanted to note too is if listeners, if you listen to the plot and you thought, wait a minute, I think I've heard of this plot very similarly before. There's definitely a lot of inspiration drawn from 2001's A Space Odyssey by Kubrick. Of course, I think maybe someone's heard that name.
Possibly.
Um, and it's really interesting looking at the visuals of the film, looking at the pacing of the film, and it's you can't help but see that there was a lot of inspiration with that similar film, but that film I think had released a bit of a decade earlier.
Yeah,
So
1968.
yeah,
This film is
so
also glaringly similar to an episode of the original series, which we'll get into.
yes. Leonard Nimoy initially refused to participate due to being upset over unpaid royalties from Star Trek. So Spock was initially left out of the screenplay. Can't even imagine that. Someone
Ridiculous.
else's Spock. Uh, Nimoy had a legitimate bone to pick with Paramount. They had been using his likeness in advertisements without giving him a penny. And director Robert Wise, having been informed by his daughter and son-in-law that the film would not be Star Trek without Nimoy, they're geniuses, sent Jeffrey Katzenberg to New York City to meet Nimoy, and describing Star Trek without Nimoy as buying a car without wheels. Katzenberg gave Nimoy a check to make up for his lost royalties, later recalling himself on my knees begging the actor during their meeting at a restaurant to join the film. Nimoy was dissatisfied with the script, and his meeting with Katzenberg led to an agreement that the final script would need Nimoy's approval. So it's really interesting to think about someone like Katzenberg on his knees begging for this, but I think that just really showed how much he believed in the vision of the film um, needing Nimoy as Spock, which I think is absolutely true.
Yeah, 100%.
On March 28th, 1978, Eisner called a massive press conference to announce that two-time Academy Award-winning director Robert Wise would be helming the new Trek film. Some of the films that Wise has directed was West Side Story, which he co-directed, which is an Oscar win. The Sound of Music, his second Oscar win. The Haunting, The Andromeda Strain, The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Sand Pebbles, and The Hindenburg. It's also worth noting that he edited the film Citizen Kane, so he does have science fiction under his belt, as well
Boring
as
science
some
fiction.
boring science fiction, but also
You ever see
musicals.
The Andromeda Strain?
I haven't, but it's funny. I saw that on the list. I'm like, I actually haven't seen that one, but that is a classic.
Michael Crichton's first novel.
Yeah.
Very similar looking film to Star Trek The Motion Picture. It's no coincidence that Wise directed it. This is one of the most impressive resumes of any director ever. Robert Wise, all over the place with genres. What if
all
I
over
told
the
you this?
place.
The guy that directed The Sound of Music also directed The Hindenburg and Star Trek and edited Citizen Kane?
Which is very impressive and shows you,
Yeah.
one, I like to think a great director has a strong vision, and this director had like 25/20 vision probably.
MVP of
How
this
do you
movie.
yeah, how do you put that in a room with Gene Roddenberry? Hey, am
I
I hinting at something?
maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Wise is the MVP of this movie. Without him, I think this
Yeah.
movie would have been a disaster.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And we're going to touch more on that. But, bringing this film to life, of course, needs, a good budget. The budget was originally $15 million, and everything seemed to be finally on the right track in development of the movie. But as filming loomed near, there was once again major disagreements over the script, which led to multiple rewrites. Much of the rewriting had to do with the relationships of Kirk and Spock, Decker and Ilya, and the Enterprise and V'ger.
V'ger.
So basic V'ger. So basically, the entire film's story. On more than one occasion, Roddenberry intercepted Livingston's drafts before they got to the studio's executives and made his own rewrites, which understandably angered the other parties. And we're not just talking about angering the writers. Of course, it's everyone was very unhappy with this.
I know that Trek was his baby, but it really sounds like Roddenberry was extremely difficult to work with. He repeatedly kept butting in and making changes without consulting anyone. It really sounds like he was just working for himself during this writing process. He just wasn't willing to collaborate with anyone.
I was reading some articles and looking at some interviews that had been done with the crew, and something that really shone through is that while Gene Roddenberry was, of course, called a visionary, called just a genius, there was also difficult to work with, is putting it lightly. He had a very strong vision for what he wanted to put forth, and when you think about it, it makes sense. It was a very strongly built universe, but when you put him in the room with also a Academy Award winning director, with a lot of success under his belt, you can see where a collision was on course.
Yeah.
By March 1979, fewer than 20 pages from the original 150 pages of the screenplay had been agreed upon for use in the finished film. Shocker. Later in the writing process, both Nimoy and William Shatner contributed with their own ideas about the final act of the story due to a clause in their contract. Despite the rewrite of the final scenes, the studio execs clashed with Roddenberry about the script's ending, believing that the concept of a living machine was too far-fetched. The executives consulted science fiction writer Isaac Asimov. If the writer decided a sentient machine was plausible, the ending could stay. Asimov loved the ending. I did want to note there was something that Asimov did end up influencing in the film. And it was just the usage of wormholes and actually replacing it with a warp hole instead. I don't know if that was caught in the film.
Oh, that's a good bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So that, I think, also just touches nicely on how really grounded in science, strong grounded science theory that they really tried to commit to when putting this film out. So kudos to that. Listeners, if you haven't heard of Isaac Asimov, then at least go look him up. But very important to science fiction. Not just science fiction, but just writing in general. Very influential.
So one of the
You'll,
movies that we're going to cover eventually, for Fantastic Voyage, he wrote the novelization to that. Cool little
that
bit.
and that is a very cool little bit.
Let's plow ahead with the production of Star Trek, the Motionless Picture.
Robert Wise deserves a ton of credit for shepherding all the egos involved in the screenwriting process. Everything that we read about this points to him as the calming presence and the reason this worked. Sets that originally built for Phase 2 were repurposed for the film, led by production designer Harold Michelson. The Enterprise was entirely redesigned. In all, they spent nearly $2 million constructing the sets. During production, Star Trek used 11 of Paramount's 32 sound stages, more than any other film done there at the time. Filming wrapped up in January 1979 after 125 days, and Paramount tried to hire special effects legend Douglas Trumbull, who had worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he had just completed work on Close Encounters, to supervise the effects, but he refused, and he was trying to be taken more seriously as a director rather than just an effects wizard. Trumbull's refusal meant that Paramount had to settle. Originally, the model and effects work were overseen by Robert Abel and Associates, along with Alex Weldon. But as filming began to lag behind schedule, rumors began to swirl. A year into the production, millions of dollars had been spent, but almost no usable footage had been created. Robert Wise was furious with Abel's slow progress, and in February 1979, Abel and his company were fired at what must have been an enormous cost. They finally brought on Trumbull to finish the job in time for a Christmas 1979 release. The effects budget alone ballooned to $10 million, and this was after Paramount had already paid Abel's company $5 million. So that's massive.
Just blowing money
More,
fast.
more than 100 matte paintings were created for the effects. If you're curious, just look very closely in the background in San Francisco.
Oh, if you're a matte painting enthusiast, this film is for you.
Oh, yes. Trumbull and the effects crew were working on this up to the very last minute. Some of the effect shots were completed mere days before the film's release. By the time the motion picture was finished, $26 million was spent on the film itself, while $18 million had been spent on sets for underdeveloped Phase 2 series, much of which were not used for the film itself, which brought the total cost of the movie to $44 million.
Anton, some
This ended up,
perspective here.
yeah.
This cost 200% more to make than Paramount initially budgeted it. For some perspective, for contemporary films, it cost roughly 5 times more to make than the first Star Wars film, and 5 times more than Alien. It cost 50% more than The Empire Strikes Back, which came out the following year. So at the time, this was the second most expensive film ever made, second only to what? I'll give you a hint. It came out the year before this. We covered the sequel to this film already.
We covered Alien.
Superman.
Superman okay,
was the
fair.
most expensive film ever made at this point.
Oh man, that was my third guess. I was gonna guess Shrek after.
Right, you have to guess Shrek. Yeah. But it's just kind of staggering how much more they spent on this than Star Wars. It's just
it's nuts.
I'll say this: at least you can see where the money went in this movie. In its defense,
no, dude, no denying that this is a pretty film.
Yeah,
and seeing the Enterprise in all its glory is so worth it. Jerry Goldsmith was hired to compose the score. It's one of his best-known works and one of the finest scores of all time. And Patrick, are you a fan?
It's a masterpiece. It's one of my favorite film scores.
Am I wrong in the score for this film was also the opening credits for The Next Generation?
Correct, it is.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say maybe there was something distinctly different, but...
No, it's the same.
Yeah.
They use Goldsmith's.
Yeah. Yep. Iconic. And it's also just... I think leaps and bounds better than the original series theme, but I'm sure someone's going to fight me over that.
Oh, no, I agree with you there. I like the original series theme, but it is better suited for TV. This is a proper film score.
This is a legendary film score.
Yeah, this is, oh man, I don't have enough good things to say about this score. It's worthy of all the hype and the praise that it's received. It's just a cool bit. I mean, we'll get into it a little bit more, but I mean, Anton, would you agree this score alone prevents this from being a bad film, in my opinion? That's how solid it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's so... It's just to put it simply, it's so right. Like, it fits perfectly.
A lot of really different themes. It's like a solid 90-minute score, too. Yeah. It's a Goldsmith, man. His name should be up there with John Williams. It really should. He was a great composer, and I think he died a while ago, and I'm worried that like younger audiences don't know enough about the guy because he really put the work in.
Well, let's make sure to do a proper shout out and and a YouTube short for Jerry Goldsmith.
Will do.
So, because of the rush to complete the film, the motion picture was never screened before test audiences, something Wise later regretted, and he was never fully satisfied with the finished film. And it's worth pointing out that in 1983, an extended cut premiered on the ABC television network, which added nearly 12 minutes of unfinished footage. Wise never approved of this either, and that's the primary reason for the director's edition, which was released in 2001, which I distinctly remember.
It's on Paramount Plus right now.
When it was finally released in December 1979, the motion picture set the box office record for the highest opening weekend gross. It became the fifth highest grossing film of the year, and it was nominated for 3 Academy Awards: Art Direction, Visual Effects, and Original Score. The film sold the most tickets of any film in the franchise until Star Trek 2009, and it remains the highest grossing film of the franchise worldwide adjusted for inflation. So, despite being a financial success, Paramount considered the motion picture a disappointment when factoring in expectations and marketing. So much so that they put the next 2 sequels under the Paramount Television division with a miserly Harve Bennett as producer, mostly without Roddenberry's participation. The budgets of those films were much lower, and it showed. Roddenberry would remain bitter about this for the rest of his life. The film sits at a 53% Rotten Tomatoes score.
Yeah, this is really it was the first and last Star Trek film to really have the big screen look until the J.J. Abrams reboot. For the rest of these movies, up until then, they were always looking to save money. How can we keep the budget down? Oh, we're going to have to reuse some sets. We're going to have to reuse some special effects shots from the previous film. They were all made on the cheap, and I actually think some of them look really good considering their limited budgets. But it's just interesting. This is the first and last time that Paramount ever spent big making a Star Trek film until 30 years later, the J.J. Abrams reboot.
That is amazing to think about. But funny enough, even despite that, the films are still very successful for the most part and
Oh, yeah,
still
yeah.
iconic, right? Like, so it's just interesting to think about. Like, there's still so much staying power despite that.
Oh, I don't think it's necessarily a flaw, but it is noticeable. If you watch this film and you watch it back to back with like Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock, you can tell like, wow, they really had the budget cut.
I think I wonder too, though, if part of that is they realize certain things that they spent money on, they didn't necessarily need to spend money on,
Oh,
and they could be more
100%. Yeah.
efficient, and they could be more efficient with the budget. Something that's really interesting to think about too, and this really ties in with more connection to like larger or like legendary effects studios like Industrial Light and Magic. They tapped them in, right, for a lot of the sequel films.
Yes.
And even then with practical effects, you still see it still looks good to this day, despite the fact that it didn't have as much of a but large of a budget as the motion picture.
Yeah, for sure. Anton, let's talk about why this wasn't better. I want to start with number one, the pacing. The pacing of this film is so slow, I would describe it as glacial. It moves at a snail's pace.
Mm,
Entire chunks of the film go by where almost nothing happens plot wise. It's probably the biggest criticism of this film, hence the nickname the Motionless Picture.
are you saying that this film did not go into warp drive?
It did not.
No, it did not.
Even when it does go into warp drive, it's still somehow moving slowly. There's no better example of this than the shuttle ride to the Enterprise, right? This is probably the most famous example scene that's always cited of how slow this movie is. It's brilliantly scored by Jerry Goldsmith. The special effects are amazing. It is beautiful to look at. It also seems to take up 10 minutes of runtime.
I think so. I was reading a bit about that, and when you think about the pacing of the film and like where was the really points of emphasis, some of it was literally just, well, we spent money on it, might as well show it off, if that makes sense,
It
right?
does.
Like, and honestly, like when you're watching that shuttle ride to the Enterprise, I don't think like up to that point anyone had really seen what the Enterprise could truly look like until that point too. Let's really think about that.
It's a great call.
Before in the Star Trek the original series, it was always just models that you see in like some sort of like,
It looked like
I don't
crap.
know, like
It was
it
TV.
was
It
a
was TV
diorama.
effects from the 60s.
Right.
Nothing
And
against
now
it,
you
but
and now you finally have the opportunity. You're Gene Roddenberry. You finally have the opportunity to show the vision for what you, if this was reality, this is what it would look like. And I think like you don't want to sacrifice that if you have the budget for it. And so why skip that over? Maybe it doesn't make for great pacing in a story,
no.
but it's a great opportunity to really show and really display just how gorgeous it looks. And like even in the rewatch, I was just like, I agree with you. I wanted to snooze a little bit, but at the same time, it's just amazing to see.
Did you fast forward through it a little? Just a little?
I have to admit I did.
I did too.
But to be fair, it's because I'd seen it before.
Even the action scenes somehow managed to be slow. And
Yes.
the funniest example of this is when they get caught in the wormhole, everything just gets dragged out like, belay that order. It's so funny. It's like a legit action scene. They're going at warp speed, and it still manages to move like they're all stuck in molasses with all the blurring. By the way, cool effect. I'm not quite sure how they did it. It looked like some kind of
Yeah,
animation they were doing over it. Pretty effective.
there was a lot of overlay scenes that you may have like there was a where there was that famous scene with Spock going through going through, and he's in the spacesuit going through like the stars and the moon, and then eventually he goes into like the core
A V'ger.
and a V'ger, and that actually is a very similar effect of just overlaying like existing objects. I forget the name of just like that. It was basically like if they'd overlaid a lava lamp on the set. Was how they did a lot of different kinds of
Yeah.
effects.
It's all reflected on his helmet like perfectly.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at one point when they're approaching the V'ger energy field, like I counted, a full 90 seconds goes by where like literally nothing happens. Nothing. They just move. It looks like 20 feet through space. But yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
and
there's a bunch of scenes here. I fast forward through them, and when I rewatch this movie, and I like this movie, just for the record.
right.
But like, there's just stuff where you're like, all right, I can cruise through this.
I think in particular when I think about, we've touched on how great the score is for this film, and it is important to note that sometimes an effective score also is seen when the score, like when music isn't used in a scene. But at the same time, there are a lot of moments in the film where a film felt even longer because it was just dialogue and
Yeah,
nothing was moving along, because at the end of the day it's just crew members speaking in the cabin of the ship. And I really felt that when there were two different pivotal scenes that I felt like this feels like longer and maybe a bit more boring than it should, but they're feel pretty important scenes. There was one where Kirk's talking to Decker and saying, I'm replacing you. And the scene felt like it didn't need to be that long. And if you notice watching that scene, there's no score, nothing like kind of underlying of the tone of the scene. And maybe that was just to kind of add to the awkwardness of the scene in itself. But it was just interesting to see like a very pivotal scene like that just kind of, it felt a little dragged on. And that was just one example of that, like, of that layered dialogue in an increased length that dragged onto the pacing. And then the second, when Kirk and Bones are recruiting Spock back onto to be part of the crew. If as folks that have watched the film will remember, Spock went on his whole journey in the desert, trying to get rid of his emotions, and I
Kolinar.
think yes. And I think one of the criticisms, right, is just how certain interactions among the characters felt a bit muted, and you could really feel it in that scene, which maybe it was written to be purposefully, but it also just added to just this grating pacing. that of this dialogue that was meant to maybe add more exposition, but at the same time just felt way too long.
Everything is detached and clinical and strained, and just the pacing matches the tone of the film, which we'll get into in a little bit.
I was going to say strange, clinical, replace detached with skin tight, and you've basically described their costumes in the film.
Oh, I have a whole thing to say about the costumes when we get to them. How everyone's dressed like space dentists.
And how basically you see way too much of every character's private parts.
Yeah. You were a fan of Shatner's gorilla arms?
Only if you were a fan of Shatner's girdle that was exposed in very many scenes.
Almost as much as I am a fan of when Bones beams up from apparently Studio 54. He has a goddamn medallion on his neck.
I was living life in retirement. I don't want to be here.
Damn it, Jim. I was just trying to play shuffleboard in West Palm Beach. This is 135 minutes, and it feels like 3 hours when you watch it. I like this movie, but there's certain parts. I have it in the notes somewhere. It takes them an hour to get on the Enterprise and get going. That's a full hour. There's probably 40 minutes of just the crew staring at the view screens as they travel further into V'ger. But the pacing is so slow, Anton, that I almost enjoy it because of how different it is to any modern film. There's no chance of this being made today. It was a deliberate decision on their part.
I agree with you. We touched on this on an earlier episode. You compare the pacing of how films open, like the original Alien, to a film like Alien 3, and it's night and day, right? The opening for Alien captured
Slow.
This is what it's like in space. It's slow, and it feels vast. It feels empty. A film like this would not get greenlit today, right?
No. I mean, and even the J.J. Abrams reboot, which I do like quite a bit, the pacing of that movie is just breakneck speed. It's throwing a million miles an hour at you the whole time. So, but Douglas Trumbull, the special effects supervisor, he said when he was talking about that dry dock scene, quote, "I wanted it to be this beautiful, epic, spectacular sequence that had no dialogue, no story, no plot. Everything stops and let the audience just love the Enterprise. I wanted everybody to buy into the beauty of space and the beauty of their mission and the beauty of the Enterprise itself, and just have everybody get out of their way and let that happen, which is something I really learned with Kubrick in 2001. Stop talking for a while and let it all flow," end quote. Well, they pulled that off.
They did. I mean, they did. And at the same time, I think that trying to recreate the beauty of 2001 is way too hard. That is like lightning in a bottle, right?
Ooh, I have a rebuttal. I think they did successfully do that.
Oh, I'd love to hear your argument for how did they succeed.
It's a better looking film than 2001. It has everything visually. It has everything that Trumbull established with the special effects on 2001, just better. It just has better effects. I'm not saying it's a better film, but this has some trippy effects in it.
So I see what you're saying. So objectively, from like an effects standpoint, those visuals, yes, I do agree. Like the execution of those effects do look better, but I do think that as a whole, 2001 was a much better complete product.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, that's not something that's arguable.
No. Continuing our discussion of why wasn't this better. Number 2, the storytelling. I have in my notes here, this movie is a unicorn. It's the example of something that only existed once and there's no possibility of it ever happening again. This is clearly just an original series episode called The Changeling, about a probe called Nomad who is returning to our solar system to find its creator. Even the writer, one of the writers on here, Alan Dean Foster, he claims that he had never seen that episode. I find that very hard to believe because he wrote all of the novelizations to the animated series. He was very familiar with Star Trek, and when he worked on the story for this, I just don't believe that he never saw that episode. There's just no way.
Well, in the industry, they actually call that a lie. And even if he did take inspiration from the episode, like it's not like it's a bad, plot to go by. It is very compelling. It's very interesting, and one that one could argue is still even relevant right now. I mean, what what has been discussed about AI, if not kind of all over the news?
That's a good point. That's the real reason why we're covering this movie. We should have mentioned that in the beginning. It's really just because of AI.
Well, I mean, I do want to, touch on that. Is I like to think about different films, and I think the great ones really touch on subjects that end up having a story and subject matter that has staying power and really resonate over time. And I think that's why I really love Star Trek, is because it talks about these things like what does define humanity, or what is like the what defines like intelligence, and it does it in a way that feels cool and exciting because it's also set in space with different crews, and it's Star Trek, but at the same time, like, it's very deep and very relevant to what we're seeing now in the news about, hey, is it right to have Chat GPT starting to delve closer and closer to replacing a lot of jobs out there?
Yeah.
And if it starts to realize itself, what does that entail?
We could do a whole podcast episode on just that.
Yeah, we could, but that's not a movie, so we're not gonna.
Correct. Well, this isn't a movie either. That's the problem with this story. This is a 135-minute episode of the original series, and that's the biggest problem with this story. And that's one of the biggest criticisms of this film. Like, while I enjoy this film, TV and film are two different mediums. Gene Roddenberry, for all of his brilliance, he failed to realize this when he was writing this film. As a result, the plot of this movie, it's just simply not very exciting. This would have just worked much better as an episode of the TV series, which is what it was originally. Is this enough meat to stretch across 135 minutes? No.
Not without a lot of filler.
That's the thing. Jerry Goldsmith's score and the special effects, they're doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
Yeah,
It's very
absolutely.
pretty to look at, but you could really tell they were trying to stuff the runtime. There was no need for this to be 135 minutes with this plot. And then, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. V'ger gets introduced. Kirk and the old crew take the Enterprise out of the dry dock. They develop engine trouble when they're traveling to their destination. And then Spock is reintroduced. This takes approximately 1 hour to develop.
Wow.
Spock arrives on the Enterprise at like the 54-minute mark.
Yeah, just about.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, in the context of when this movie came out, it was disappointing to some Trek fans. Having a retread of an old episode from the original series, it didn't feel new to a lot of audiences.
To be fair, though, if Trek fans got everything they want, then there'd be a lot of fan fiction out there that would have been created that is just god awful.
That's a good point. You touched on the tone of this film earlier. Star Trek usually has this like Kennedy era space race optimism to it. This film feels very sterile and cerebral in comparison. And it was clearly trying to be like 2001: A Space Odyssey. And just to recap, we mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating that this has very little in common visually or thematically from the rest of the films that would follow.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. With it feeling so distinct, did you like that? Or were you kind of like, I don't know how I feel about this?
I like it in retrospect. I think if I had just seen this film, I don't think I'd like it. But having seen this and then having seen the rest of the films, I appreciate how much it stands out. What about you?
I was gonna. So what's hard is I think I have to compare it to my favorite film in the series, or at least when you have the films with the original crew. My favorite is the second, Wrath of Khan. When you put them, 1v1 with the motion picture Wrath of Khan, very different. You almost want to say that it was a course correction, very strong course correction, because of the motion picture. And there's a lot of things that felt a lot more familiar with the second film. A lot of embracing what I think was more so pushed away in the first film, that I think a lot of fans really wanted. So if the motion picture was trying to take a more brave approach to how to create a film and how to make it feel more distinct than the original series, 2 was embracing the formula that made the original series more successful. Is that fair?
Very fair. I think Wrath of Khan is the best Of the original films, it is not my favorite, and I will keep you in
Which
suspense until we cover
Oh,
it.
you're keeping us in suspense. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Well,
Okay.
namely you. I don't know how much the listeners care which is my favorite Star Trek film, but I know you do. So I'll keep you in
Yeah, I
suspense.
do. I do. So,
I'm gonna have you guess when we cover it.
okay. Well, it's clearly the final frontier. So,
I'll give you a hint. It is not Final Frontier.
oh, so it's Generations. Awesome.
Final Frontier is the most unintentionally hilarious of the original films. I'll give it that.
You're thinking of Undiscovered Country.
Do you not like Undiscovered Country? Great movie.
No, it's a great one.
Yeah.
But they're all fun in their own way.
Yeah, they were man, they were getting old by that point.
Yeah.
You know what Wrath of Khan had that this doesn't have? A compelling villain. V'ger is a cool concept, to your point earlier, but not a compelling antagonist. And then you discover V'ger isn't even really a villain. It's just looking for its creator, and it zaps anything out of existence that gets in its way, just like Nomad from The Changeling. And that's part of
Yeah.
there's very little tension when this is revealed. I know it's late in the film, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that's funny because it's almost a huge parallel to if one were to think about Spock's role in the crew. He's very logical, right? Likes to look at the situation, especially in the film, likes to look at the situation and objectively say, like, do this, do that. It's never anything personal. It's just what's best. And when you look at it like that, then the decisions of the being are in itself not ones of a villain, not one of a hero, not one of like a predator to take out a species, but one that is just most logical for itself. And that is just a being trying to survive. It doesn't make for like a TV villain, but maybe makes for like a science fiction villain.
yeah. It's just not enough story to stretch across 2+ hours. This is what's known as a hangout movie. We're just hanging out with the crew of the Enterprise for 2 hours. Basically, nothing happens. The characters are going somewhere in space to stop something from happening. McCoy even makes a joke about it at one point. He's just like, there's always a thing we have to stop.
But I mean, it was enough of a thing that
It was enough.
It was enough of a thing that Kirk got to replace Decker as captain of the Enterprise.
Stop competing with me, Decker.
After and this got to me too, when he said, yeah, I got promoted, on whose authority or why are you replacing me? And Kirk says, well, after 5 years of doing this. It's like he's did it for 5 years and he's admiral.
You know, I read this is supposed to take place only a couple years after the original series. If that was their intention, they're like very clearly 10 years older.
Yeah, which actually, if you wanted to look into the part of like the development and the special effects was actually they were playing with different ways to actually make the cast look younger in the film.
Leonard Nimoy had a ton of makeup on. He looked like Dracula.
And they were purposefully trying to make them again look younger, but they actually embrace their age, obviously, in the sequel films.
Yeah, something the sequels did well is they addressed it. They didn't ignore it. But it's thinking about this movie and rewatching it. The real heart of this movie is the relationship between Decker and Ilea. It's not really the main crew. Ilea is the most important character in the film, along with Decker.
But do you like them as characters?
Yes. Ilea is not a very interesting character. What happens to her is obviously interesting. I think Decker is an interesting character because he represents something that would never happen in the films again, where we have this supporting character who is not a traditional member of the, main cast. He's not a threat to Jim Kirk, but he does represent a challenge to Kirk's ego in a lot of scenes. And I think it's interesting. So Kirk comes in, takes command of what is really Decker's ship. Decker, as he points out, knows a ton more about the ship than Kirk. But I think it's a well-written character in the fact that he never really is antagonistic towards Kirk. All of his objections are reasonable. He acts as a very good executive officer. He points out to Kirk, like, I'm just trying to offer you alternatives because that's my job. Kirk is the real dick. That's what I thought was interesting. A lot of films would have made Decker antagonistic, and this one didn't. And I liked how they did that. I think that was clever screenwriting on their part.
If anything, Decker was more of a foil to Kirk,
Yeah,
and maybe if anything, a mirror and reflection for Kirk to look at, and almost something to work towards that maybe points out some flaws in Kirk, because ultimately Decker also makes quite the ultimate sacrifice in the end.
he does willingly. It's interesting when he does. You get like Tron vibes, even though this preceded
Yeah,
Tron.
yeah.
You could make a case that this is the most Star Trek-y Star Trek film, and we'll get it when we cover
Hmm.
subsequent films in this series. I think it's very interesting where we can open up the discussion of, is this a good Star Trek film or a good film?
Oh yeah, that's a good call out.
And I'm going to call out specifically Star Trek Into Darkness, right? Which was another
Hmm.
polarizing film. Some fans liked it, some fans didn't. I'll reveal my opinion of it now if you want. I don't think it's a very good Star Trek film, but I do think it's a good action movie.
Yeah, no,
I
that's
like
fair.
watching it, but compared to what is traditionally a Star Trek film, it's so much like the original series, almost to a fault.
I was gonna say, even the 2009 Star Trek film, that was more of an action film than I
Yeah,
felt like an episode of Star Trek.
very much so. I think it did a good job of using all of the elements from Star Trek. But yeah, it's just a straight up action film, which is fine.
Right. And I think maybe that is something to respect about this film, about the motion picture, is that even with the storytelling, even with whatever story decision they decided to put into the film, it didn't sacrifice or try to move toward, like, try to appease to a trend of, like, how do you create like a huge big space battle, um with, like, that's like the battle of all battles with like antagonistic like Klingons or what have you. They kind of
Right.
embrace that more in the sequel films.
They definitely did.
um
It's interesting they didn't do that here. They could have tried to blow up the Death Star at the end of this, and instead we get a couple characters walking into a matte painting.
I mean, to be fair, you did have moments of, like, there was like some action in the film, but it wasn't like, when I like to think of film adaptations, there was always some sort of big bad, and especially with bigger franchises, trying to kind of bring it all into like a, this is like that battle that sums up like how we're facing like this like entity or like true antagonistic force, sometimes in the form of like a big battle, but that didn't really happen here.
I'm fine with it. I like the climax of this film. I like that it was the
Yeah.
Voyager probe. I thought it was clever. Yes, it's similar to
Yeah, I
the
agree.
TV episode, but I thought the concept is cool. Is it exciting? No,
Yeah, and that's very Star Trek.
it is. No, that's a really good point on your part. Like, do they need to have a big bad villain all the time? No, they don't. One of my favorite Star Trek films has no villain. It just has a problem that the crew needs to solve.
Yeah, I mean, even like when I think about the Next Generation, I forget the name of the exact episode, but basically the premise is, if one of your prime directives is you can't interfere with a civilization that is developing.
Right.
So whatever you're witnessing, you can't interfere, even if it's something that seems horrific to you. Like, you must let the civilization continue to develop. Is that morally wrong to not interfere if you could have prevented something horrific from occurring? So that in itself, like, and that's literally the episode and what the question that they're trying to answer.
Those are
There's no,
reasons why we love Star Trek. Those kinds of
yeah,
scenarios.
and but that's a really, that in itself is an example of, there's something happening, but there's not necessarily like a big bad. And I feel like this film is an example of, here's a moral quandary, and here is what's happening in the film. What do you do? How do you navigate it? And you get that.
Definitely. When it comes to the storytelling, I found this wonderful, wonderful quote from comedian Patton Oswalt. He sums up this movie so brilliantly. Quote, Star Trek the motion picture is oatmeal colored uniforms on a gunmetal colored ship. Everyone's in a bad mood. Nothing really happens. They get to this thing at the end where it's a Voyager spacecraft, but it thinks it's God, and you're like, I've seen this plot a million times. In fact, I think there was a plot of the Star Trek show that was that. I'm glad that Star Trek the motion picture exists, though, because it is such an absolute failure in adapting the source material that it made them go make Wrath of Khan. The Wrath of Khan should basically be called Sorry About the First One. Here's the second one. We'll make it really good. I don't think you have to have expertise in the source material, but you have to have a sense of fun and a sense of joy. Know at least what the core of the engine that makes it tick is, and know how to use that you need. It's beige people on a gray background in a bad mood for 2.5 hours. That's what they should call Star Trek the motion picture, beige Trek. I don't fully agree with everything
uh
he says, but I
yeah.
love the quote. It just makes me laugh. He does make a lot of good
Yeah.
points. I don't think it is a failure to adapt the source material, though. I think they succeeded in what they were trying to do. Now,
Yeah,
just
no, I
does it
agree.
work on a 2-hour film? Not really.
No, I think one could argue that there were a few, like, especially with how maybe they want, like, a lot of folks would have wanted more on an alien surface world adventure of James Kirk actually doing adventuring like he did in the original series to be part of like the first film as part of the sequel, as a sequel to the original series, which of course again they embrace in the sequel films. But at the same time, there are those episodes like we talked about where it really is just like the move, like the way that it would carry out in the motion picture. So I agree with you. I don't think it's a failure, but I can see why maybe some people would shake their head at it.
Oh, completely. I would not fault anyone for giving this movie a terrible rating just because of how unexciting it is. Like, I completely understand. The criticisms of this film are all valid. They're all fair.
Yeah. I mean, like I haven't said it outright, but like at the end of the day, like I don't think that if they were going to pick any storyline to be the driving force of this film of like a Star Trek story, I don't think it's the most interesting one. I think like yeah, sure, like it's relevant today, but I think that it's not as juicy or meaty that like it's funny because that actually parallels exactly what you were talking about earlier. I don't think it's as juicy or meaty to really even justify like a film.
No. And that alone makes it interesting to me. This art house Kubrickian approach that they were trying to do.
Hmm.
Anything you want to add about the storytelling before we move on to the acting?
I love that embracing, like I love that you embrace the art house aspect of it. It really did feel like they were trying to do something unique and really were trying to do something distinctly different from the original series. And like I've gone on record on this podcast saying I love to see directors or films do that. And I'm never going to be one to fault directors or fault films for trying to embrace that, because that's what makes great films. That's what makes films different from any other popcorn big budget movie that's coming out in theaters, because that's how you get something unique and interesting.
For sure. Let's talk about the acting. They're all TV actors traditionally. They're all trying to act in a big budget movie. I don't consider any of the performances amazing. They're competent. Leonard Nimoy is even more detached than usual. No one's ever going to call Shatner or DeForest Kelly like brilliant actors. I like what they're doing here, though. I like how everyone's kind of in a bad mood. I
Yeah,
like how Kirk is just a total dick. It's not how Shatner portrayed the character in the original series. I like how they're just different characters. They're 10 years older from the last time that we've seen them, and I think their performances reflect this.
that's fair. I think that in on the other side of it though, it was so distinct and such a different take that that is what polarized audiences.
Yeah, definitely.
And even myself, I think that seeing a very extra emotionless Spock felt hard to appreciate and get into. I would like to see a bit more emotion and excitement if you're coming back together as friends after so long. But at the same time, I can also respect like, hey, this is how they want to show it, and maybe they develop this more in the future. But I think that that really did rub people the wrong way, was how these characters were portrayed in the film.
Yeah, it did. You don't get the payoff until the end when they all like really reunite. Like Spock shows up and he's just there's the one funny part when Uhura says like it's how we all feel, Mr. Spock, and he just completely ignores her, just doesn't even acknowledge her. He's just like I'm gonna
that,
go down to engineering.
if that's illogical, I don't care.
I really do like McCoy in this though.
Oh yeah, no,
He looks laughable when he shows up in the Studio 54 like disco suit. Damn it, Jim. I was just trying to drink Harvey Wallbangers in West Palm Beach and they drafted me back into service.
Bones is a treasure, and I think one of the best things that they did in the revival or in the reboot alternate universe 2009 Star Trek is Carl Urban as Bones. I
He did a
thought
great
that
job.
was a fantastic portrayal.
Completely agree. Yeah, I mean, everyone's just grumpy.
Mhm.
They all have strained relationships with one another, but I think it does create a pretty good character arc because it does pay off at the end. They all become friends again at the end. I already talked about Decker and why I think he was at least an interesting character. I think the less we say about Stephen Collins, the better. What did you think of Persis Kambata as Ilia? She is the most important character in the film.
One, I do think it's a great performance, especially like if you're reading that script and you're like, okay, this is what you have to do, is like basically like you're the mouthpiece for this sentient being that's actually a probe. What do you do? And I think that, hats off to her, she did a great job. But I think that that was also something probably that polarized a lot of folks, was just having her in the film, if that's fair to say.
She did do a good job, and especially when you consider she was not an actress. She was a model.
Yeah.
Yeah, rest of the performances, I mean, this is not what you would call a showcase of acting.
Yeah. Did they ever explain why she was fully bald, or is that just a future thing?
She's Deltan. She's an alien.
Got it. Okay.
That's
This is
just
a future.
she exudes
future
sexuality. Hence that comment to when she comes aboard. She says to Captain Kirk, "My
Captain
oath of
Kirk.
celibacy is on record."
Right. Exactly.
And there's a quick little bit when she shows up. She steps off the lift. Chekhov and Sulu like really react to her walking in, and I just find it funny how Kirk, who is a notorious womanizer, he's just completely unfazed by her.
Like, this is just another Friday for me.
Bones, I'm used to this.
For whatever reason, Nichelle Nichols wouldn't. I kept trying to ask her out for a dinner on Fridays after shooting, and she wouldn't respond to me. But
something about working together. Bones, you're a madman. Barefoot, you say?
Shatner is. I'm a big fan of William Shatner.
I like
Shatner's great.
I think he gets unfairly maligned for his performances. He puts on some good performances throughout this series.
But fair to say that he's a bit of a ham. But that's part of him.
Yeah.
And I like it.
Yeah. Oh, I think if you take him out of this role and replace him, it wouldn't work nearly as well.
No, it's why he's like so iconic.
Yeah.
Is because he's the way he is. I mean, can we have anyone else yell Khan?
We can. In Star Trek Into Darkness, someone else yells it, but we'll get to that film. Don't worry.
But we'll get to that, and that was not as memorable. So
I want to talk about the real star of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which is the production, because the special effects here are amazing, amazing. They spent a lot of money. You can tell they spent a lot of money. There's a handful of shots that look dated, but most of it holds up really, really well. There's even shots in this film, Anton, where I'm still not quite sure how they accomplished them in 1979.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think that that's a really good point, but I think one that shows like just even if you have really great effects and really strong score, like you need it takes a lot to put film over that. Is this a great film hump, right?
Yeah. It's certainly one of the best looking films that I've ever seen. The model work, the matte paintings, all of the cinematography that Robert Robert Wise uses. The camera moves around a pretty good amount when they're inside the ships. Everything's stunning to look at. It's some of the most beautiful effects I've ever seen. I don't know how you would rank the films, but this has got to be at the top of the list of like pre-CGI effects films. V'ger has a proper sense of scale. There's a lot of shots that show how small the Enterprise is compared to it. They do a really good job of establishing that. When the warp engines are pulsating inside the engine room, it looks like modern CGI was used for the glow of the engines. I'm not quite sure how they did it. It must have been some kind of animation. And then when
Mm-hmm.
that whiplash probe comes in and takes Ilea, it's shot like a horror scene. They're using some weird frame rate. I'm really not sure how they pulled that scene off. It's very effective.
Yeah, no, and a lot of I think that was a fun scene because you see a lot of emotion, you see a lot of like tension in the scene, and then like you said, the special effects in the scene. That was actually one of the better scenes, I think, or like one of the more memorable scenes in the film.
All of the blocking that Robert Wise does,
Yeah.
I think, is really effective. I think I said jokingly earlier, there's like 40 minutes of the characters just staring at the view screens. And
Mm-hmm.
Wise does a really great job of everyone. It's convincing that everyone is looking at the same thing. Sometimes with these movies, you get when the blocking isn't well thought out, you have scenes where they all look like they're looking at different things, but not so here. They did it right. One of my favorite effects in the film is when they go to warp speed. All the streaks of light are like red, white, and blue. It's got this like disco thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Everything about it is real cool. There's a lot of split diopter shots. Brian De Palma would be proud. And
Yeah,
we
no,
talked about the score. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say like when you think about what other films came out that year and what like the staying power of how good the film looks, it's still very impressive. 1979 of course didn't come out like not to say that there were like horrible films in 1979, um
Alien
but
has great
it's I was
effects.
going to say that's a film with great effects,
Moonraker,
but
great effects.
I was I was going to say even compare it to if anyone ever saw Amityville Horror, like very
Was that
different
year?
film. That was that year.
Okay, yeah.
That actually grossed more in the box office than this film.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, but it's again two very different categories.
Yeah.
But even 1979's what was it? I mean, even like like I have to say, like if you're comparing this with Moonraker, I think Star Trek wins in terms of special effects.
I agree. Wait till we talk about Moonraker. Oh, man. What a movie.
Can't wait.
Let's talk about Jerry Goldsmith again. It really is. It's his magnum opus. It's probably his
Yes,
best work.
iconic.
Like I said, it's a complete score. It's like 90 minutes. That distinct alien sounding V'ger theme that's played on an instrument called a blaster beam. Really unique sound.
That's awesome. Like you said, want to give due respect to Jerry Goldsmith. I think that it's great to highlight composers that maybe don't have as much share in the limelight, right? But
Yeah.
definitely deserve it.
Well, I think film buffs of a certain age know who he is. Of course, he was a huge name. But I think if you're younger, you might not recognize him, but you would certainly know his work. He did this. He
Mm.
did Alien. He won an Oscar for The Omen. He composed multiple films a year. I mean, but real famous stuff like Planet of the Apes, Poltergeist, the Rambo series, Total Recall, Chinatown is one of his best scores.
So banger after banger after
Yeah,
banger.
it's so much good work. If you're into film scores at all and you've heard enough John Williams or James Horner, check this guy out. His work is extraordinary. Let's talk about the costumes, Anton. They
Ugh.
received a ton of criticism.
I mean, I would argue very warranted criticism.
Yes. They're kind of cool looking just because it was a one-off. Like, it was just this look that never existed in the films again. But they are kind of bland. Everyone's dressed like a space doctor, space dentist, like they're working in a hospital. There's the weird disco-inspired stuff that they have going on.
Yeah, the shirts are all of the lengths of the different sleeves are either way too short or a little long.
Yeah, I think everything Patton Oswalt said about them is fair.
They all looked a little bit too uncomfortably tight.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, for the rest of the series, they would be wearing like naval-inspired sweaters, basically.
Again, as a very strong course correction.
Yep. But I think if you sum up the production, you really can see every dollar on screen. It's a spectacular looking movie, especially in 4K.
I think if you did have to look at like a Mount Rushmore of Paramount films, this does end up being on that Mount Rushmore just because of how iconic it is for the studio, for better or worse.
I mean, look, all the V'ger stuff alone makes it worth watching on a big screen.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like it's just trippy. All the stuff that they go through. Anything to add about the production, Anton?
Like you said, you see every dollar on that screen. I really love that metric of where do you see the money go? And well, as we know in the production, they spent a lot of money on making sure that the special effects were right. And I just wanted to touch upon again, like being able to see the USS Enterprise in all its glory is very satisfying.
All its beige chrome glory. Well, that's it. Let's wrap this up, Anton. I'll go first here because I
Mhm.
picked it. I think this film is far more entertaining to look at than it is actually entertaining. If you were going to call this movie flat out boring and you gave it a poor rating, I would not argue against you. Like I said earlier, all of the criticisms that are directed at this film, I think, are valid. I do enjoy it for what it is. It's a long, drawn out TV episode with top dollar movie production. I like the arcs that the characters go through. The V'ger concept is pretty cool, very sci-fi. This film is so unique that I do enjoy watching it from time to time. Visually, it is so pleasing to the eye that I would pay good money to see it on a big screen. Whether or not you like it, you should appreciate this film for what it represents. It's far from perfect, but it is entertaining in its own way. It represents a bygone era. It is something that would never be made today, and it is for a lot of those reasons that I appreciate it. I rate this movie a B.
Very well said, Patrick. I do really respect this film. I think I said it before, I think this goes on Paramount's like Mount Rushmore just because of how important this film is. But a lot of this film for me is also just there's a lot that I didn't love, and a lot of that is the pacing. I didn't quite particularly love the story itself. If we look at it as the parallel of this is just a long extended Star Trek episode, it definitely wouldn't be one of my favorite episodes. But because there was such care and attention, and they really put so much into the budget of the special effects, and they really did try to take a brave approach to what they did with the film. Like I respect it, but at the same time, like it's not my favorite film. But I do like to go back to it. It was really fun to do the rewatch, and I definitely have a lot of respect for this film. All things considered, I put this at a C. And but at the same time, I do recommend to all listeners, if you haven't watched it, check it out and definitely give us your take on where you think this sits amongst the annals of Star Trek film history.
Very fair rating. I can't argue with that. I would say one thing to build on what you were saying. If you were trying to get anyone into Star Trek, this would not be the first film,
Yeah.
which is, I guess an indictment of it. But regardless, that is it for Star Trek the Motion Picture. Anton, we're going to be recording another podcast in 10 hours. Are you ready?
Excellent. I'm so ready.
Yeah, for the listeners, it's pretty late here on the East Coast. And as soon as we're done here, I am going to go to sleep. I am going to wake up. I am going to possibly go to the gym, eat breakfast, and then record another podcast.
Yep. And that's how much we love doing this. That's how much we're dedicated. And I can't wait.
Indeed. Well, we will see you on the next edition of Why Wasn't It Better? Cheers.